From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen will discuss a pair of rulings recently rendered by the Kansas Court of Appeals. The first involves a dispute among family members over the installation of a new irrigation system and whether that constitutes a land improvement when it came to divvying up the farm property. And the second regarding a declared violation of show animal fitting rules that led the Kansas State Fair to strip the Market Lamb Championship from a youth exhibitor. And something special today, we'll sit down and visit with K-State's Gus van Der Hoeven about his radio series on life in rural Kansas, Stop, Look, and Listen, which concludes its 45-year run today. Here on Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening in once again. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Time once more to hear from our guest every other Wednesday here on the broadcast as he shares the latest on the agricultural law and taxation front. Roger McEowen back with us from the Washburn University School of Law. And what we wanted to draw upon this time around, Roger, a couple of decisions both made this past month by the Kansas Court of Appeals. They're different in their orientation, of course. One has to do with land valuation and what happens when family members inherit a property, but the disposition of that property isn't well split out amongst those members. Explain, if you would.
Yeah, what this is the classic problem of a partition action that's filed by children or a child after a parent dies and leaves the property to them, the farmland to them, in co-equal ownership interests. And it creates a problem. And I have mentioned this for years. I have preached on this at seminars to attorneys, to tax practitioners, to farmers and ranchers. Don't do this. Don't do this for your clients. Don't do this if you are a client. Don't set it up like this. Think of some other way to leave your farmland to the next generation so that it's not torn up and split up, because some child most likely is not going to want to farm, wants to cash out of that property, or wants a specific tract rather than just an equal co-ownership interest in the entire farm. It just creates a lot of problems from an estate planning standpoint, and particularly if your intent is to keep the farm intact from generation to generation. This is not the way to do it. We do not want to leave property this way, but that's what happened in this case.
This case vividly illustrates that. It originated from north central Kansas. Explain the particulars here. What happened between the siblings and the widow of one of the siblings?
Mm-hmm. Well, you had three brothers, and they each inherit an undivided co-equal interest in farmland. It's dry land, cropland, and one of the sons that inherited the property had been farming with his father for years, and he had indicated to his father that maybe we should convert this to irrigated cropland, which, of course, would increase the value of it, and they'd have to get a water permit from the state to do that so that they could divert water to run the irrigation system. And father thought that that would be a good idea, but he passed away. And the land ends up going to the three boys in co-equal, undivided ownership interests, and a very simple estate plan, very common estate plan, but it has its problems. And again, I do not advocate for this approach. And one of the brothers died, and it's the two surviving brothers and the sister-in-law, the widow of the deceased brother. And one of the brothers decides, well, I'm going to go ahead and do what Dad and I had talked about. I'm going to go ahead and get a water permit and buy some irrigation equipment. So he does get a water permit from the state, and he pays $83,000 for a 10-tower pivot irrigation system and the piping and a water meter and all of that comes along with it. And that, the court pointed out, was clearly his personal property. He had bought that property. It was his personal property. And the sister-in-law did not contribute at all to the cost of the improvements. Well, long story short, she files a partition action in court, in the local county district court, to sever the co-ownership because she wanted her share out of that. She wanted a particular tract. And of course, when you file a partition action, the court has to value the entire property and then split the proceeds equally. So now we've got three people that are involved here. We have some dry land, and now we've got some irrigated land that's worth a lot more than the dry land. So the court has to figure out what the value is. They named 3 parties named as commissioners, termed as commissioners, to figure out what the value of that property is. And they come up with the value of it, and it's $399,000 on the dry land and $2.065 million on the irrigated land. So you put that together, we got about $2.4 million in change, and so about $800,000 or $833,000 around in there is what her third share would be worth. Well, she says, I only want the smaller dry land tract, and the court said, well, that's worth, according to what the commissioners came up with that valued it, that's $390,000, and that's short a bit of her $833,000 that she's entitled to. So there's a sum that the court says, all right, we're going to put a sum over here. You're entitled to $428,333 to balance out your share. You're going to get this smaller tract plus that amount. And the court set aside $50,000 in an escrow account, and the other brother said, well, that $50,000 should be credited to us because that is the amount that is attributable to the improvements that we put on the land.
The argument comes in, and the rub of this case is that irrigation system an improvement on the land, though, for purposes of splitting out the value, as this sister-in-law wanted to get out.
Yeah, that's exactly what was going on. The trial court said, no, she's not entitled to the $50,000 because all we're valuing here is we're not going to value the personal property. We're just looking at the land. And the appellate court said, no, that's not the right approach here. When you change from dry land farming to irrigated cropland farming, that increases the value of the land. And so the value of the improvements, that personal property, is not the only thing to look at. What you want to look at is the enhanced value of the underlying property because now it's more productive. And so when you factor that in, the bottom line on this is that the trial court made a mistake in denying the brother's counterclaim and remanded the case back to the trial court to determine whether the trial court should award credit for the value of the irrigation equipment based on an assessment of the evidence that had been previously presented at trial. Not new evidence. It's just trial court made a mistake in evaluating the evidence, so we're going to kick it back. So this is just one of those illustrations of the problems that you can run into when you leave your property in co-equal undivided interest to your kids.
Good lesson. Court of Appeals ruling early May of this year. Another one out of the Court of Appeals for the state of Kansas. This harks back to an episode at the Kansas State Fair in 2016, and it had to do with a fitting and showing violation of livestock, or so it was declared. Explain if you would.
Yeah, it actually involved the grand champion lamb at the 2016 Kansas State Fair. And the Kansas State Fair rules bar exhibitors from treating any part of an animal's body, either internally or externally, with a substance to alter what's called conformation. So if you're changing the look of the animal by some sort of substance, either internal or external, you can't do that. That's a violation. That's called an unethical fitting. And before the fair was over, in this instance, after the lamb was crowned the grand champion, interestingly enough, and the court doesn't explain this, but this is odd, that before the fair was over, the lamb was removed from display, because normally the champions remain on display for the duration of the fair. That did not happen in this instance. The lamb was removed from display, slaughtered, and its meat was sold to market. And after it was processed, then a veterinarian analyzed the lamb's carcass and saw multiple injection marks on the back of both hind legs and associated swelling and discoloration in the muscle and the fat and abnormal reddening of the skin over those areas. And the vet concluded, based on that multiple recent injections. Now, he didn't pin down how recent those injections had been, but he just said recent injections had occurred that likely caused those abnormalities, and concluded that even though there were no drugs in the lamb's system, that there was some sort of natural substance that had been injected and led him to conclude that that altered the lamb's appearance. And the State Fair Board said, okay, that's an unethical fitting. We're going to declare this improper, and we're going to strip the lamb and the student that showed the lamb from the title as grand champion.
The disqualification here, but that exhibitor turned around and sued the State Fair Board for this action.
She did, and basically she went through 2 State Fair committees, and you got to go through the administrative process before you can get into court. So she went through 2 State Fair committees with no success, and then jumped into the legal system. The trial court said, well, the vet's findings didn't provide substantial evidence as to an unethical fitting. He confirmed, the vet did, his findings of injections, but the trial court said, well, he didn't find that the lamb's appearance had been altered, and he never used the term unethical fitting, which was correct. Now, that's not really the job of the veterinarian to do that anyway, so he didn't do that. He just said, this is what I saw. You draw your own conclusions. And the court said, well, based on that, the board's decision was unsupported by the evidence, so they reinstate the championship status for the exhibitor and for the lamb. Then the state fair board appeals that, and that's how we got before the appellate court.
And the appellate court decided what then on this?
Well, they looked at state law, and when you go back to state law in terms of where state law, who did the legislature vest the authority to make the rules upon? And they said, that's not the veterinarian, that's the state fair board. The state fair board has the right to set the rules for the state fair, and those rules, the court said, provide a non-exhaustive list of examples of what could be considered unethical fitting. And since it's a non-exhaustive list, the court said that the state fair board could consider injections to be an unethical fitting, even though it's not listed in the examples that are provided in the regulations. So the appellate court reversed the trial court and said there is substantial evidence to establish that the board's decision to disqualify the lamb in accordance with the state fair board's rules was proper, and that an unethical fitting does not have to be attested to by a veterinarian. So the veterinarian's out. He just provided his findings. And then it's up to the state fair board to make a decision. The court said it's the state fair board that has the decision-making authority. And that's the way the legislature set it up. And that's really what this case is about.
Yeah. Well, the particulars on that case, the previous one we talked of, and many more, can be found on Roger's blog series at the Washburn University School of Law website, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, to be more direct. As always, Roger, thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you, Eric.
Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, along with us every other week here on Agriculture Today. You are listening to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Special occasion on this part of the broadcast, for in just a few moments you will hear the final edition of a long-standing feature here on Agriculture Today. You're very familiar with it, of course, if you've been tuned in any length of time at all. Stop, look, and listen. It is a presentation weekly by our guest now, Gus van Der Hoeven, retired as an extension, landscape, and environmental horticulturist at Kansas State University. And Gus, thank you. We wanted to visit with you for a few moments before the final program. Remind us, and you cover this each and every week, it seems, in some form or fashion, but your background and how you arrived at K-State all those years ago.
Well, I came from VPI, Blacksburg, Virginia, to Kansas State in 1974, and as we've often said, I came on April the 1st, and I've always felt it was very appropriate. But before that, I worked for a Dutch company in North Carolina, Mount Airy, North Carolina. It was a bulb importing and growing company, and before that, I was in Australia and ran a dairy farm, managed it, worked as hard as everybody else, if that is management, and I went through college. Before that, I grew up in the Netherlands. But my love for land, my love for landscaping, my love for what goes on in and around agriculture, what we see around us, that I think was innate in me from the time I learned to walk. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of stories. But I grew up in a beautiful area of the Netherlands, which, small as it is, has many different landscapes. And I love it, still love it, but that's the background. The Netherlands, the accent is Dutch, Australia, North Carolina, Virginia, Kansas. And now I've lived since 1974 in Kansas.
And to that, then, what was the origin of Stop, Look, and Listen? Again, a story which we've touched upon a few times over the years, but it's well worth repeating.
Well, the beginning story, realize we go back to 1974, right? A long time ago. when I met Kansans, they apologized for the state. They say, oh, Kansas is so plain. Oh, Kansas is that. And these were Kansans who said that. And I got mad. I didn't come to Kansas to be told that Kansas wasn't what it is. They felt and apologized that it was not as pretty or as beautiful as other states. And I disagreed. In my job, I traveled all over the state, north, east, southwest, corners and everywhere. I found it a fascinating and interesting state because, as I've said before, agriculture is two words, agros and culture. And the culture of agriculture is clearly visible in the landscape of Kansas. We have created our landscape, and that, I think, is important. And the fact that most land is owned in private hands makes it that we are responsible for our state. But when you drive and look or fly over Kansas, you see it is an agriculture state with cities, of course, and industry, but basically it's the landscape of agriculture, and I loved it.
To the point that you approached my predecessor, Paul D. Weiss, to express these very sentiments in a regular radio broadcast, which first was not a monologue. Is that correct? It was a visit just like this, more or less?
I sat down with Paul one time, just like I'm sitting with you, and we discussed it. I said, Paul, I get these responses by the people and apologies. It makes me mad. I want to do something. I want to start a radio program. What do you think about it? And, of course, we had our regular educational program where we spoke about topics in horticulture. But this was slightly different. And I have never known if Paul thought this would be a dialogue or a monologue. The trouble is, when I started, I had prepared what I wanted to say. And Paul said, okay, go ahead. And whereas every other program, like what we are doing now, I'm free to speak, you listen, and it goes, I could not do that. I said, Paul, I have part script I want to stick to. That is what I want to say. And Paul laughed. And he said, you can do it. You've done so many already, educational programs. I said, Paul, I can't. So then we switched, and I presented what I wanted to say, and it was a controlled format, but that's what I wanted to say, and henceforth, that's how we presented it.
And it started formally then in, 1978, somewhere in there?
The first one was about 75, late 75 or 76, because it was in the beginning of my traveling and meeting people with the county agents who then said, oh, we're sorry. I don't know what they expected because of my Dutch background. And the other funny thing is that many said, you talk like my grandpa. Over the years, I've learned, okay, the German background, the Swedish background, the Norwegian background, a little bit of Dutch background, Irish background, all the other backgrounds. We've all met them, or you can meet them in Kansas.
Then the program rolled, and weekly you would come in and record your stop, look, and listen. Explain for a moment, if there is a recipe, what the process is, how you generate the ideas that lead to the weekly essay here.
The process is very simple. I relax, and I think about what in the last few days or in the last week or over a period of 2-3 weeks has caught my attention. And that's why we have stop, look, and listen. Looking and listening is a big part for me to present this program from what I see. And it varies. The book, which we wrote a year and a half ago, picks out 106 topics out of the 2,300, 400 I have on shelf.
Was going to ask, how many does it amount to?
Close to 2,400, more or less. At this stage, I got them all on the shelf. I wish I save the very first one, I didn't. But the topics come to you if you pay attention to people, to the scenery, to what you see, but don't forget people. Listen to people. Kansas people are fascinating in all its diversity. And I can tell you stories, which I won't do now, but the funny part of it is, in meetings or whatsoever, stories come. Kansans tell and create the stories. All you have to do is hand them back in a way that they say, oh, I didn't know that. And it becomes fantastical. The very first one I did, and you may say, where did you pick it up? Well, how do you start? I look. And I remember in a town, I rode an alley. I love alleys to drive, to see what was happening behind the houses. And there was a little shed and a little garden. And there was an older woman who walked from the kitchen door to the garden shed and lifted the hoe. And then, as I slowly drove and looked back, she stood and bent over and started to weed her vegetable garden and flower garden. There was so much beauty and so much good maintenance in that backyard where, with the little picket fence, it was a picture. And I still see her with the big sun hat, quietly, very peacefully, working in her backyard, cleaning it, having picked a hole from the wall of the old shed. And the old shed was probably an old garage opening up in the alleyway.
That's been the secret of the program. With your unique vision, you can pick out things that are ordinary or day-to-day in most people's eyes and bring their specialty to light.
Yeah, but our daily lives are generally, nothing big happens. But sometimes you have to make it happen. Sometimes you have to see it. And that is where the beauty, we don't have big mountains, right? Mount Sunflower. And there are jokes about it. You know, a guy with skis on top of it, skiing down all the way to Virginia. You might say, downhill we go. But that's not it. You have to see, and that's sometimes the same in people. And I think what I have learned by giving myself to Kansas is that I have received back from Kansas more than I gave. And I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. And we do need to let you gather thoughts for the last stop, look, and listen after this break, Gus. Gus van Der Hoeven, retired research and extension specialist in landscape and environmental horticulture, and, of course, the weekly presenter of that program. And we'll have the final go-round of Stop, Look, and Listen for you in just a few moments on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
I'm not looking for the station, but this is a moment in time.
That's Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Many, many years ago, when I was still busy working across the state, my Australian friend sent me a poem by Robert J. Hastings. The poem is The Station, a reminder to cherish the journey. I see it as very fitting at this time. Here it is, the station. Tucked away in our subconscious is an idyllic vision. We see ourselves on a long trip, traveling by train. Through the windows we drink the passing scene of flatlands and valleys, of mountains and rolling hillsides, of city skylines and village halls. But uppermost in our minds is the final destination. On a certain day and at a certain hour we will pull into the station. Bands will be playing and flags waving, and once we get there, the pieces of our lives will fit together like a completed jigsaw puzzle. How restlessly we pace the aisles, damning the minutes of loitering, waiting for the station. When we reach the station, that will be it. When I'm 18, when I buy a new 450 SL Mercedes-Benz, when I put the last kid through college, when I reach the age of retirement, I shall live happily ever after. Sooner or later we must realize there is no station, no one place to arrive at once and for all. The true joy of life is the trip. The station is only a dream. It constantly outdistances us. Relish the moment is a good motto. It isn't the burdens of today that drive men mad. It is the regrets over yesterday and the fear of tomorrow. Regret and fear are twin thieves who rob of us today. So stop pacing the aisles and counting the miles. Instead, climb more mountains, eat more ice cream, go barefoot more often, swim more rivers, watch more sunsets, laugh more, cry less. Life must be lived as we go along. The station will come soon enough. Robert Hastings. I'm not looking for the station, but this is a moment. In the 48 years that I've lived in Kansas, something happened to me. I grew up in a landscape with trees. Woodlands opened up with farmland. Tall, singular trees standing in the meadows. I loved it, and I always will. But I've caught myself going to top of hills, wanting to see, distance, and observe the sky. It is Kansas landscape I now also love deeply. It too has a history, and over a relatively short time was turned into the cultural landscape it is today, an agricultural landscape. I'm asking you to take care of our state, Kansas. And remember, whenever you write a letter, do not abbreviate our state to KS. Write it full out. It's Kansas. Thanks for listening. And that's it. I'll see you down the road.
Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University. And Gus, we can't thank you enough for your 45 years of unequaled perspective on our home state. Our time's away once more. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.